You have the wrong man. You are making a serious error.
I'm done talking! You're obstructing a federal investigation! You're coming out of that chair. We'll put you on the floor where you belong.
The morning sun of a crisp Arizona autumn sliced through the blinds of Sergeant Frank Miller's small, meticulously kept bungalow, striping the hardwood floor with bars of pale gold. The air smelled of freshly brewed black coffee and the faint, clean scent of gun oil from the previous night's ritual of cleaning his old service pistol, a practice more about memory and discipline than any perceived need for protection. At 48, Frank's world had shrunk to the size of this house, but he had made it a fortress of routine, a sanctuary of peace. The rhythmic whir of his electric wheelchair was the house's heartbeat, a constant companion since an IED outside of Fallujah had traded his legs for a lifetime of memories he'd rather forget. He maneuvered the chair with an unconscious grace, a seamless extension of his will, gliding from the small kitchen to the living room with a mug of steaming coffee balanced perfectly on his lap. His body was a roadmap of his service. The thick, silvery scars that crisscrossed his forearms, the permanent ache in his lower back that no medication could fully silence, and, of course, the two inert legs that rested on the footplates of his chair. But his eyes, a clear and steady blue, held no trace of self-pity. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the worst of the world and had chosen to focus on the quiet good he could find within his own four walls. On a bookshelf, nestled between thick military history tomes, was a single-framed photograph. It showed a younger Frank, standing tall and proud in his dress blues, his arm around his wife, Sarah. Her smile was radiant, a beacon that had guided him through 2 tours. She had been gone for 3 years now, taken not by war, but by a quiet, merciless cancer that had been a different kind of ambush. Since then, his routines had become more rigid, more necessary. They were the retaining walls against a flood of grief. This Tuesday began like any other. After his coffee, he navigated to his small home office, the wheels of his chair rolling silently over a protective mat. He spent an hour answering emails for a veterans support group he volunteered for, his powerful, scarred hands moving deftly across the keyboard. He offered advice on navigating the VA's labyrinthine bureaucracy, provided a listening ear to men half his age struggling with demons he knew intimately, and organized local meetups. It was his way of continuing to serve, a way of ensuring the men and women coming home now had a slightly softer place to land than he did. He was a man defined by duty, even when the uniform had been put away for good. His service hadn't ended when he was carried off the battlefield, it had merely changed form. He glanced at the clock. 9:15 a.m., time to check on the small garden he cultivated in raised beds in the backyard. It was another form of therapy, coaxing life from the stubborn desert soil. He just finished his emails when the sound came. It wasn't a knock. It was a violent, percussive boom that seemed to shake the very foundations of his quiet world. Boom, boom, boom. It was a sound he knew well, the sound of a breaching ram. His military instincts, dormant but never gone, flared to life. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He wasn't in Fallujah. He was in a quiet suburb of Phoenix. But for a terrifying second, the two places became one. "Federal agents, open the door!" The voice was muffled but full of a harsh, aggressive authority. Confusion warred with a lifetime of ingrained respect for a command. Frank wheeled himself away from the desk, his mind racing. Federal agents? What could they possibly want with him? He was a disabled veteran who paid his taxes and kept to himself. It had to be a mistake. He reached the front door just as another series of earth-shaking blows rained down on it. The wood around the lock splintered. He fumbled with the deadbolt, his hands suddenly clumsy. "I'm coming! Hold on!" he shouted, his voice rough with alarm. "I'm disabled. It takes me a moment." The door flew inward before he could fully unlock it, torn from its hinges with a final, violent crack. It slammed against the interior wall, dislodging the framed photo of him and Sarah. The glass shattered as it hit the floor, the sound a sharp, crystalline tinkle in the sudden, terrifying silence. Standing in the gaping doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning sun, were three men clad in tactical vests with the bold yellow letters ICE emblazoned across their chests. They held firearms in a low-ready position, their eyes scanning his small living room with a cold, predatory intensity. The man in the lead, who looked to be in his early 30s, had a cruel set to his mouth and eyes that burned with a self-righteous fire. He took a step inside, his boots grinding on the shattered glass of the photograph. He held up a piece of paper. "We have a warrant for the arrest of Marco Ramirez," he announced, his voice devoid of any courtesy. "Are you Marco Ramirez?" The question was absurd. Frank was a middle-aged white man with military short graying hair and blue eyes. The name on the warrant clearly belonged to someone else entirely. The mistake was obvious, comical even, if it weren't for the guns and the splintered doorframe. "My name is Sergeant Frank Miller, United States Marine Corps, retired," Frank said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "You've got the wrong house." The lead agent, whose name tag read Thorne, barely glanced at him. His eyes swept the room again, as if Frank's simple, direct statement was a lie that the furniture itself might betray. Agent Thorne was a man who saw the world not in shades of gray, but in a stark binary code of threat and non-threat, and his internal programming was dangerously flawed. He was young, ambitious, and carried the unshakable certainty of a man who has never been forced to question his own judgment. To him, every door he kicked in concealed a criminal, and every denial was merely a prelude to a confession. The two agents behind him, Russo and Patterson, were older and carried the weary cynicism of men who had seen too many raids go sideways, but they were caught in Thorne's orbit, pulled along by the sheer gravity of his aggressive confidence. Patterson exchanged a fleeting, uncertain glance with Russo, a silent acknowledgement that the man in the wheelchair did not fit the description of the 25-year-old cartel runner they were looking for. "I don't care who you say you are," Thorne snapped, taking another step into the living room. His boots crunched again on the glass, a sound that grated on Frank's every nerve. "We have information that Ramirez is at this address. We're coming in." Frank held his ground, positioning his wheelchair as a meager barricade between the agents and the sanctity of his home. "I'm telling you, you've made a mistake," he repeated, his voice firm but controlled. He was trained to de-escalate, to handle volatile situations with calm authority. He was not a suspect. He was a citizen in his own home. "There is no Marco Ramirez here. I've lived in this house for 15 years. I'm the only one who lives here." He gestured with an open hand towards a small table by the door where his wallet and keys lay. "My identification is right there. My name is Frank Miller." Thorne's eyes narrowed. In his worldview, cooperation was often a form of deception, and a calm demeanor was a mask for defiance. He saw Frank's wheelchair not as the result of a sacrifice made for the very country Thorne represented, but as a prop, a potential shield. He saw the man's military bearing not as a sign of discipline, but as a challenge to his own authority. "Everybody says there's someone else," Thorne said with a contemptuous smirk. "We'll sort this out after we've secured the premises. Now move out of the way." Frank didn't move. It wasn't an act of aggression, but of principle. This was his home, a home he had fought for, a home he had bled for, the home where he had nursed his dying wife. The idea of these men trampling through it on a fool's errand, with their muddy boots and their casual violence, was a violation he could not permit. "You are not going to search my home based on a faulty warrant," Frank stated, his voice dropping to the low, commanding tone he had once used on the battlefield. "You need to verify your information. Call your supervisor. Check your facts. You are making a serious error." That was the moment the situation tipped from a tense mistake into a deliberate act of malice. For Agent Thorne, being questioned, being told he had made an error by a man he already viewed with suspicion, was an intolerable insult. His jaw tightened, and a muscle feathered along his cheek. He looked at Frank, truly looked at him, and saw not a decorated veteran, but an obstacle. The quiet dignity, the refusal to be intimidated, it was all fuel for Thorne's simmering rage. "You're obstructing a federal investigation," Thorne hissed, the words a clear escalation. He took another step forward, closing the distance until he was looming over Frank's seated form. Frank could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "That's a felony. Is that how you want to play this?" The other two agents shifted nervously. Russo opened his mouth as if to speak, to inject a note of caution, but a sharp glance from Thorne silenced him. This was Thorne's show now. He was the lead agent, and he was losing control. "I am not obstructing," Frank said, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair. "I am asserting my constitutional rights. You have the wrong man, the wrong house, and you have illegally broken into my home." He said the words clearly and deliberately. For the record he was building in his own mind. He knew the importance of a clear and accurate account. He had written too many after-action reports to forget. The mention of his rights seemed to infuriate Thorne even more. It was as if the law was a weapon being used against him, rather than the principle he was sworn to uphold. "I'm done talking," Thorne declared, his voice dangerously low. "You were told to move. You're resisting." He reached out a hand, not to move the chair, but to grab Frank himself. The air crackled with a sudden violent energy. The quiet Tuesday morning was gone, shattered as completely as the picture frame on the floor. In its place was a raw, naked aggression, a storm that had burst through Frank Miller's front door and was about to descend upon him. Thorne's hand clamped down on Frank's shoulder like a vice. The grip was brutal, fingers digging into the muscle and bone already weakened by years of disuse. Frank's training screamed at him to react, to break the hold, to defend himself. But he was strapped into a wheelchair, his legs useless anchors. A lifetime of physical prowess had been reduced to the strength of his upper body, and he was in no position to fight back against a younger, able-bodied man, armed and armored for combat. "I am not resisting," Frank gritted out, the words strained by the sudden pressure on his shoulder. "You have no reason to touch me." The plea was not for mercy, but for reason, an appeal to the law and procedure that Thorne was so flagrantly ignoring. The agent's face was a mask of furious self-righteousness. "You're coming out of that chair," Thorne snarled, his voice a low growl. "We'll see how cooperative you are when you're on the floor where you belong." The statement hung in the air, dripping with a venom that went beyond the immediate situation. It was a declaration of dominance, an act of pure humiliation. The wheelchair was Frank's mobility, his independence. To be torn from it was to be rendered helpless, to be stripped of his last measure of physical autonomy. It was the ultimate violation. Before Frank could process the threat, Thorne acted. With a powerful, violent heave, he yanked Frank sideways. The world tilted crazily. Frank's hand flew out, instinctively trying to grab onto the armrest of his chair, his only point of stability in a suddenly unstable world. His fingers found purchase for a fleeting second, but Thorne's momentum was too great. He was pulled from the seat, his body a dead weight. The metal frame of the wheelchair dug into his side as he was dragged across it. A searing pain shot through his ribs, sharp and electric. He let out an involuntary cry, a raw sound of agony that was swallowed by the chaos. For a moment he was airborne, a helpless tangle of limbs. Then gravity took over, and he crashed onto the hardwood floor with a sickening thud. The impact knocked the wind out of him, his head striking the polished wood with a sharp crack that sent stars exploding behind his eyes. His left arm was trapped awkwardly beneath his torso, and a fresh wave of agony radiated from his shoulder, far worse than Thorne's initial grip. He lay there, gasping for breath, the familiar smell of lemon polish and wood dust filling his nostrils. His useless legs were twisted at an unnatural angle, a stark, pathetic reminder of his vulnerability. From his new, humiliating vantage point on the floor, he looked up. Thorne stood over him, breathing heavily, his chest puffed out like a conqueror. Agents Russo and Patterson stood behind him, their faces a mixture of shock and a dawning horror. They had signed up to catch criminals, not to brutalize disabled veterans in their own homes. But they did nothing. Their silence was a form of consent, their inaction a betrayal of the oath they had sworn. "Now," Thorne said, his voice laced with triumph. "Let's try this again. Where is Marco Ramirez?" Frank could only shake his head, the movement sending a fresh wave of dizziness over him. He tried to speak, but his lungs refused to cooperate. He could only manage a ragged gasp. He was no longer Sergeant Miller, a respected veteran in his own home. He was a piece of evidence, an object to be manipulated, a body on the floor. He could feel a warm wetness trickling down his temple from where his head had hit the ground. The shattered picture of him and Sarah lay just inches from his face. A large shard of glass rested across her smiling image, bifurcating it. The symbolism was devastating. His life, his peace, his dignity, all of it shattered in an instant by the blind arrogance of one man. He pushed himself up with his good arm, the effort sending daggers of pain through his ribs and shoulder. He managed to prop himself up on one elbow, his body trembling with a mixture of pain and rage. He looked Thorne directly in the eye. "My name is Frank Miller," he wheezed, each word a monumental effort. "And you have just assaulted a United States Marine, in his own home." The words were not a threat, but a statement of fact. A line had been crossed. This was no longer a mistake. It was a crime. Thorne seemed momentarily taken aback by the defiance, by the fire that still burned in the eyes of the man he had just thrown to the floor. But the flicker of uncertainty was quickly extinguished, replaced by a doubling down of his own authority. He unclipped a pair of zip ties from his vest. "You're under arrest for assaulting a federal officer," Thorne lied, the fabrication bald and instantaneous. He was no longer just covering his tracks, he was paving a new road to justify his brutality. Across the street, in the two-story house with the perfectly manicured lawn, Carol Peterson was watering her prize-winning roses. At 68, she was a widow, a creature of habit much like Frank, though her routines were filled with gardening clubs and calls with her grandchildren. She and Frank had a comfortable neighborly relationship built on years of waving across the street, exchanging pleasantries over the fence, and the occasional sharing of a lemon cake or a bag of homegrown tomatoes. She knew he was a veteran, a quiet man who kept to himself but always had a kind word. She respected his privacy and the silent battles she suspected he still fought. The first loud boom made her jump, her hand jerking and sending a spray of water across her porch steps. Her heart fluttered in her chest. It sounded like a car crash, but there was no screech of tires. Then came the second and third booms, followed by shouting. It was coming from Frank's house. Her first instinct was concern. Had he fallen? Was there an emergency? She set down her watering can and walked to the edge of her porch, her view partially obscured by a large oak tree. She could see the front of Frank's house, and the sight made her blood run cold. 3 men in tactical gear were smashing his front door in. Her mind struggled to process the scene. This wasn't a medical emergency, it was an invasion. She saw them disappear inside, heard the muffled shouts, and then a sickening crash followed by a cry of pain that was unmistakably Frank's. A primal fear seized her, but it was quickly replaced by a fierce, protective anger. This was Frank, a good man, a disabled man, and he was being attacked in his own home. She fumbled in the pocket of her gardening apron for her smartphone, her hands trembling so badly she almost dropped it. She backed away from the porch, retreating into the cool darkness of her own living room, and crept to the large picture window that gave her a clear, unobstructed view of Frank's front door. Her fingers shook as she swiped to the camera function and hit record. The lens focused on the scene unfolding across the street. The splintered doorway gaping open like a wound, the empty wheelchair just visible inside. She held the phone steady, bracing it against the window frame to stop the shaking. The device felt small and inadequate against the violence she was witnessing, but it was the only weapon she had. Through the phone's screen, she saw one of the agents, a tall, arrogant-looking one, step back into the doorway, framed like a villain on a stage. He was looking down at something, or someone, on the floor inside. She couldn't see Frank, but she could imagine him, and the thought filled her with a cold dread. The agent was talking, his posture aggressive and triumphant. Carol zoomed in as much as she could, the digital zoom degrading the image slightly, but capturing the agent's sneering expression with chilling clarity. She kept recording, her thumb clamped down on the button. The silence from the house was more terrifying than the shouting had been. It was a heavy, menacing silence, full of unspoken violence. She filmed as the agents milled about, as precious seconds turned into minutes. She recorded their body language, the way the lead agent strutted while the other two hung back, their postures radiating discomfort. Every second of footage was another nail in their coffin, though they didn't know it yet. The phone in her hand wasn't just a camera, it was a silent witness, an unblinking eye capturing an objective truth that could not be argued away. It saw no context, felt no bias. It simply recorded the brutal facts. The broken door, the empty wheelchair, the armed agents, and the terrifying aftermath of their assault on a man who had already given so much. Carol didn't know what they were doing inside, but she knew it was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. The video file grew, a digital testament to the atrocity unfolding just 50 yards away. She kept her position, hidden behind her curtains, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt a strange mixture of terror and resolve. She was terrified of the men in Frank's house, of the power they wielded so carelessly. But she was resolved to not look away, to bear witness for the man who couldn't. This small, unassuming grandmother, standing in her quiet living room, was gathering the evidence that would blow the case wide open. She was capturing the truth, frame by frame, preserving it in a stream of ones and zeros that would soon ignite a firestorm. Inside the house, the adrenaline of the initial confrontation was beginning to curdle into a thick, syrupy unease for Agents Russo and Patterson. Thorne's triumphant declaration of arrest hung in the air, a lie so blatant it was almost suffocating. While Thorne postured over Frank's prone form, Russo's eyes darted around the room, desperately seeking some justification for the chaos they had unleashed. His gaze fell on the small table by the door. On it, next to the car keys, was a worn leather wallet. Driven by a sudden, urgent need for confirmation, Russo moved to the table. He flipped open the wallet. The first thing he saw was a Virginia driver's license. The name read, Franklin D. Miller. The face in the photo was undeniably a younger version of the man on the floor. Beneath it, tucked into another slot, was a Department of Veterans Affairs ID card, the bold lettering clear and official. And behind that, a military ID, retired, Sergeant, USMC. Russo's blood ran cold. He felt a wave of nausea roll through his stomach. He looked from the ID in his hand to Frank, who was now struggling to push himself into a seated position, his face pale and etched with pain. He looked at the empty wheelchair. It all clicked into place, not as a puzzle, but as a judgment. "Thorne," Russo said, his voice quiet but strained. "Thorne, look at this." Thorne shot him an irritated glare, annoyed at the interruption of his dominance display. "What is it, Russo? Find the drugs?" "No," Russo said, walking over and holding out the wallet. "I found him." Thorne snatched the wallet, his eyes quickly scanning the IDs. For the first time since they had breached the door, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. The cocky assurance wavered, replaced by the dawning, horrific realization of the magnitude of his mistake. He looked at the name, Miller. He looked at the military credentials, Sergeant. He looked at the man on the floor. Everything Frank had told him was true. There was no Marco Ramirez. There was only a decorated veteran whose home they had just invaded and whose body they had just broken. A normal person would have been flooded with remorse, with an urgent need to apologize and render aid. But Agent Thorne was not a normal person. His mind, wired for aggression and self-preservation, immediately calculated the potential fallout. This was bad. A wrongful raid was one thing. A wrongful raid that ended with a disabled Marine veteran injured on his floor was a career-ending, multi-million-dollar lawsuit kind of bad. His response was not to correct, but to conceal. The mistake had been made. Now it had to be buried. He tossed the wallet onto Frank's chest. "So you're a vet," Thorne scoffed, the bravado returning, more forced this time. "Doesn't make you immune from the law. You were uncooperative. You obstructed our investigation." He was building his defense out loud, trying the words on for size, convincing himself as much as his partners. "We had a valid warrant for this address." Patterson, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up, his voice trembling slightly. "The warrant was for Ramirez, Thorne. This guy's name is Miller. We hit the wrong house. We need to call this in, report it." "We report nothing," Thorne snapped, turning on him. "We report that we executed a warrant. The suspect wasn't present, and the occupant was non-compliant and sustained a minor injury while resisting. That's the story. Are we clear?" He stared hard at Russo and Patterson, his eyes burning with a desperate, threatening intensity. It was a direct order to falsify a federal report, to engage in a criminal conspiracy. Russo looked away, his face conflicted. Patterson just stared at the floor, his silence a reluctant form of agreement. Thorne then turned his attention back to Frank. He squatted down, bringing his face uncomfortably close to Frank's. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "As for you, Sergeant, you're going to be smart about this. You're going to say you fell. You're going to forget we were ever here. Because if you don't, I will ruin you. I will dig into every part of your life and I will find something, anything, to charge you with. I will make you wish you'd never opened your mouth. Do you understand me?" It was a raw threat, delivered with the cold precision of a sociopath. He wasn't just trying to avoid trouble, he was enjoying this, enjoying the power he held over the helpless man. Frank, still reeling from pain and dizziness, met his gaze. He didn't respond. He just stared, his clear blue eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and pity for the small, pathetic man threatening him. His silence was more powerful than any shouted retort. It was the silence of a man who would not be broken. Seeing he wasn't getting the terrified compliance he wanted, Thorne stood up abruptly. "Let's go," he ordered his agents. "We're done here." Without another word, without offering any medical assistance, without even righting the wheelchair, the three agents turned and walked out of the destroyed doorway, leaving Frank Miller alone on the floor of his shattered home. They left behind a broken door, a broken body, and a colossal mistake they now had to pray would stay buried. But they had forgotten about the unblinking eye across the street and the quiet neighbor who had seen it all. Carol Peterson watched from her window as the three agents exited Frank's house. Their departure was not as loud or as violent as their arrival. It was quick, almost furtive. They didn't look back. They piled into their unmarked black SUV and sped away down the quiet suburban street, leaving a profound and disturbing silence in their wake. For a moment, Carol remained frozen, the phone still clutched in her hand, the recording finished. The adrenaline that had kept her steady began to recede, leaving her trembling. She had just witnessed a crime. She had no doubt about that. Her mind raced. What should she do? Call the police? But they were the police, or some version of them. Who do you call when the criminals are wearing badges? Then her thoughts turned to Frank. He was in there, alone, and he was hurt. The thought propelled her into action. Her fear was eclipsed by a wave of righteous indignation and simple human concern. She placed her phone carefully on the kitchen counter, as if it were a sacred artifact, and hurried out her front door. She ran across the street, her floral gardening shoes slapping against the asphalt. The sight of Frank's front door hanging from its hinges sent a fresh jolt of horror through her. The violation was so stark, so personal. She peered into the gloom of the living room. "Frank?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Frank, it's Carol from across the street. Are you okay?" She heard a low groan from the floor. Stepping carefully over the threshold, her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light. She saw him. He was on the floor, propped up on one arm, his wheelchair overturned beside him like a fallen soldier. The sight was so pitiful, so deeply wrong, that it took her breath away. "Oh my God," she whispered, rushing to his side. She knelt beside him on the hardwood, her knees protesting. "Frank, what did they do to you? Are you hurt?" Frank looked up at her, his face a ghastly shade of pale. There was a cut on his forehead, oozing blood that was already starting to dry. His breathing was shallow and ragged. "Carol," he rasped, his voice barely audible. They thought I was someone else." "I saw them," she said, her voice thick with outrage. "I saw everything. I called 911. The paramedics are on their way." She had, in fact, called them the moment she stopped recording, her fingers flying across the screen. "Don't you worry, help is coming." She looked at the overturned wheelchair, the scattered glass, the man on the floor. This was too much for paramedics. This was a crime scene. A thought, clear and sharp, cut through her distress. Her nephew, David. He was a lawyer, not a big shot, but a smart, decent kid who worked in civil litigation. He would know what to do. "Frank," she said, her voice firm, "we need to call a lawyer. Those men can't get away with this." Frank nodded weakly, the effort clearly costing him. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a deep, bone-wearying pain and the encroaching fog of a concussion. Carol gently took his uninjured hand. It was cold and clammy. "Just hang on, Frank. We're not going to let them sweep this under the rug." While they waited, she did what she could. She fetched a damp cloth from his kitchen and gently dabbed at the cut on his forehead. She righted his wheelchair, carefully checking it for damage. She spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, telling him about her roses, about her grandson's latest Little League game, anything to keep him grounded, to fill the violated space with some semblance of normalcy. The wail of sirens grew closer, a welcome sound for the first time that day. The paramedics were efficient and professional, their calm competence a stark contrast to the brutal chaos that had preceded them. They carefully assessed Frank's injuries, stabilized his neck, and loaded him onto a stretcher. As they wheeled him out of his broken home, Frank's eyes met Carol's. He tried to speak, but she just squeezed his hand. "I've got this, Frank," she assured him. "You just focus on getting better. I'll make the call." After the ambulance pulled away, its lights flashing silently in the bright morning sun, Carol returned to her house. The quiet seemed unnatural now. She picked up her phone and looked at the video file. It was 15 minutes long. 15 minutes of raw, undeniable truth. She took a deep breath and made the call. "David," she said when her nephew answered, "it's Aunt Carol. Something terrible has happened to my neighbor. And I think I have the evidence that's going to make the people who did it pay for every last second of it." The first stone had been cast. The ripples were about to begin, spreading outward from this quiet street, destined to become a tidal wave that would crash against the walls of federal power. The fight for Frank Miller's dignity had begun. David Peterson was a good lawyer, but he knew his limits. After hearing his aunt's frantic story and watching the stomach-churning video she sent him, he knew this case was far beyond his small firm's capabilities. This wasn't a slip and fall. This was a federal civil rights case against a powerful government agency. It required a specialist, a titan. It required someone like Elizabeth Reed. Elizabeth Reed wasn't just a lawyer, she was a force of nature. In her late 40s, with a razor-sharp mind and a reputation for taking on cases that others deemed unwinnable, she had become one of the most respected and feared civil rights attorneys in the Southwest. She had sued police departments, federal agencies, and private prisons, and she had won, securing landmark verdicts for victims of official misconduct. Her office, in a restored historic building downtown, was a testament to her success, but she had never lost the fire that had driven her to this work in the first place, a deep, unshakable belief that no one was above the law. David managed to get a meeting with her 2 days later, after Frank had been treated and released from the hospital with a concussion, 3 cracked ribs, and a severely sprained shoulder. Frank sat quietly in the plush leather chair opposite Elizabeth Reed's large mahogany desk, Carol at his side for support. He felt out of place, a soldier in a world of legal maneuvering he didn't understand. He recounted the events of Tuesday morning in a flat, dispassionate tone, the way he would deliver an after-action report, sticking to the facts, his voice betraying no emotion. Elizabeth listened intently, her intelligent dark eyes never leaving his face. She didn't interrupt, she just let him speak, absorbing every detail. When he finished, The room was silent for a moment. "And the agents identified themselves as ICE?" she asked, her voice calm and even. "Yes," Frank confirmed. "Agent Thorne was in the lead. And he made a direct threat to you before he left? To ruin you if you spoke about this?" "Yes, ma'am," Frank said. "He was very clear." Elizabeth nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to David. "May I see the video?" David slid a tablet across the desk. Elizabeth picked it up, tapped the screen, and for the next 15 minutes the only sound in the room was the muffled audio from the recording. The violent splintering of wood, Thorne's arrogant commands, Frank's cry of pain, and the chilling, triumphant silence that followed. Elizabeth watched the entire video without flinching, but as it played, Frank saw a subtle shift in her demeanor. Her posture became more rigid, her jaw tightened, and a cold, hard light entered her eyes. It was the look of a hunter who has just caught the scent of her prey. When the video ended, she placed the tablet back on the desk with a quiet, deliberate finality. She looked at Frank, and for the first time, he saw the professional mask fall away, revealing the fierce advocate beneath. "Sergeant Miller," she began, her voice low but vibrating with a controlled fury. "What happened to you was not a mistake. It was not a procedural error. It was a criminal act. It was a flagrant and disgusting violation of your Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure and your 14th Amendment right to due process. They broke into your home. They assaulted you. They denied you medical care, and they tried to intimidate you into silence. The fact that you are a decorated veteran who was injured in service to this country makes their actions not just illegal, but a profound moral disgrace." She leaned forward, her gaze locking with his. "These men, and the agency that employs them, believe they are untouchable. They believe they can kick down any door they want, brutalize any citizen they choose, and face no consequences. My job is to prove them wrong. My job is to make them accountable for every second of what they did to you." The passion in her voice was palpable. It was a righteous anger, honed by years of fighting similar battles. This wasn't just another case for her, Frank could see that. This was a cause. "I want to take your case, Sergeant," she continued. "I will represent you on a contingency basis, which means you will not pay me a dime unless and until we win. We will file a federal lawsuit against Agent Thorne, Agent Russo, Agent Patterson, their supervisors, and the United States government. We will demand compensation for your injuries, for the damage to your home, and for the violation of your civil rights. But more than that," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "we will demand reform. We will use this case to shine a light so bright into the dark corners of this agency that they will have no choice but to change. It will be a long, difficult fight. They will attack your character. They will try to twist the facts. Are you prepared for that?" Frank looked at Carol, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. He looked down at his own scarred hands, hands that had held a rifle, comforted dying friends, and held his wife's hand as she passed. They were the hands of a fighter. Thorne had thought he could break him, that a man in a wheelchair was weak. But Thorne had underestimated the steel in his spine, a resilience forged in the crucible of war. "Ma'am," Frank said, his voice clear and steady for the first time since the assault. "I've been in difficult fights before. I'm ready." A slow, determined smile spread across Elizabeth Reed's face. "Good," she said, "because we're about to go to war." The alliance was forged. The quiet veteran, the vigilant neighbor, and the champion of civil rights. Together, they were about to take on the full might of the federal government. The lawsuit, filed 3 weeks later, landed with the force of a controlled detonation. Elizabeth Reed's complaint was a masterwork of legal prose, a 40-page document that laid out the facts of the assault in precise, damning detail. It cited not just the physical violence, but the pattern of constitutional violations, framing the incident not as the actions of a few rogue agents, but as the foreseeable result of a systemic failure of training, supervision, and accountability within the agency. The complaint named agents Thorne, Russo, and Patterson individually, ensuring they would be personally liable, and it named their direct supervisor and the agency director, arguing a chain of command responsibility. The legal battle lines were drawn. The initial response from the federal agency was swift, predictable, and utterly dismissive. It came in the form of a sterile press release issued by their public affairs office. The statement was a classic example of bureaucratic stonewalling, a carefully constructed wall of denial designed to protect the institution at all costs. It claimed the agents were conducting a legitimate law enforcement operation based on credible intelligence, and that they acted in accordance with established protocols. It vaguely referred to an encounter with the resident who, it alleged, had failed to comply with lawful commands. The press release concluded by stating that the agency stands by its agents and would vigorously defend against these baseless allegations in court. There was no mention of Frank's military service, no acknowledgement of his disability, and certainly no hint of an apology. This public statement was just the opening salvo. Behind the scenes, the agency's lawyers began their methodical campaign to discredit Frank and his story. Their first move was to file a motion to dismiss the lawsuit, arguing that the agents were protected by qualified immunity, a controversial legal doctrine that shields government officials from liability unless they have violated a clearly established statutory or constitutional right. They argued that the agents' actions, while perhaps regrettable, did not meet this high standard. They were, in the cold calculus of the law, just doing their jobs. It was a cynical but often effective legal strategy, designed to crush lawsuits before they ever reached a jury. Simultaneously, they began a subtle but vicious whisper campaign. Unnamed sources from within the agency began leaking misleading information to friendly reporters. Stories began to appear on conservative blogs and in the comment sections of news articles, painting Frank not as a victim, but as an angry, unstable veteran with a potential anti-government bias. They hinted that he had a history of being uncooperative with authorities, a complete fabrication. They questioned the severity of his injuries, suggesting he was exaggerating for financial gain. They were trying to poison the well, to create a narrative that would make a future jury question his credibility. They were attempting to transform the hero into the villain. Frank found the experience disorienting and deeply painful. He had served his country with honor, had sacrificed his body for the ideals it represented. To now have that same country's government attempt to systematically dismantle his character was a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. He stopped reading the news, unable to stomach the lies being spread about him. He retreated further into the sanctuary of his home, the broken door now replaced, but the sense of violation lingering like a ghost. He felt isolated, as if he were fighting a shadow war against an enemy he couldn't see. Elizabeth Reed had prepared him for this. "This is what they do," she told him during one of their strategy sessions. "They can't defend the facts, so they attack the person. They build a wall of denials and lies and hope that we'll get tired and give up. Our job is to systematically dismantle that wall brick by brick. And we have the one thing they can't lie their way out of, the video." The agency's internal investigation, which was supposed to be a fair and impartial review of the incident, was a sham. Thorne, Russo, and Patterson were placed on paid administrative leave, a standard procedure that amounted to a paid vacation. The investigation, conducted by their own colleagues, concluded that while a procedural error had been made regarding the address, Agent Thorne's use of force was within policy guidelines, given Sergeant Miller's perceived resistance. It was a complete whitewash, an institutional closing of ranks to protect its own. The impenetrable wall of denial was fully erected. To the outside world, the agency presented a unified front of blamelessness. But behind that wall, cracks were beginning to form, and they had no idea that Elizabeth Reed was about to take a sledgehammer to it. While the agency's lawyers were building their legal fortress, Elizabeth Reed was preparing her own weapon. She understood that modern legal battles are fought on two fronts, the courtroom and the court of public opinion. With Frank's permission, she gave an exclusive copy of Carroll's 15-minute video to a well-respected national news correspondent known for his investigative work. The story aired on the evening news 1 week after the lawsuit was filed. It began with a flattering picture of a young Sergeant Frank Miller in his dress blues, followed by a summary of his decorated service record and the injuries that had put him in a wheelchair. Then, the correspondent's voice turned grave. "But what happened to this American hero last Tuesday morning," he intoned, "raises serious questions about the power and accountability of those sworn to protect us." And then, they played the video. It was presented with minimal editing. The raw, shaky footage from Carroll's phone filled television screens across the country. People watched in stunned silence from their living rooms as federal agents smashed down the door of a quiet suburban home. They heard Thorne's arrogant, dismissive tone. They saw him loom over the man in the wheelchair. And then they witnessed the most damning moment, the brutal, casual violence of Thorne yanking Frank from his chair and throwing him to the floor. The clip of the assault, lasting only a few seconds, was shocking in its clarity and cruelty. The news report ended with a close-up on Frank's face, showing the cut on his forehead and the quiet, pained dignity in his eyes as he spoke to the reporter. "I served this country for 20 years, he said, his voice steady. "I never thought I would be treated like an enemy in my own home." The effect was instantaneous and explosive. The clip was uploaded to the news network's website and social media channels, and from there, it went viral. The hashtag Justice for Sergeant Miller began trending within the hour. By the next morning, the video had been viewed millions of times. It was shared by celebrities, politicians, and ordinary citizens, each share adding fuel to a growing firestorm of national outrage. The agency's carefully constructed narrative of a non-compliant resident collapsed under the weight of undeniable video evidence. No one who saw the video could interpret Thorne's actions as anything other than a vicious assault. Veterans organizations were the first to mobilize. The VFW, the American Legion, and smaller, more modern groups for post-9/11 veterans issued scathing condemnations of the agency. They organized press conferences, their leaders, often grizzled old men in decorated uniforms, speaking with a fury reserved for the most profound betrayals. "If a man who sacrificed his legs for this country isn't safe in his own home," one retired general declared on national television, "then who among us is?" Phone lines to congressional offices in Washington, D.C. were flooded with calls from angry constituents, a huge percentage of them veterans and their families. The issue crossed party lines. Both Democrats and Republicans found themselves forced to issue statements, each trying to sound more outraged than the last. The video was a politician's nightmare. The unassailable victim, the clear villain, and a government agency acting like a gang of thugs. Frank, who had been dreading the public exposure, found himself an unwilling symbol. But the wave of support was overwhelming and deeply moving. Letters and emails poured into Elizabeth Reed's office. A GoFundMe page, set up by a veterans group to help with any potential expenses, shattered its goal in less than a day. Local people started leaving flowers and American flags on his porch. One morning, he woke to find a group of bikers from a local veterans motorcycle club parked silently on his street, standing guard in a quiet show of solidarity. The public outrage completely blindsided the federal agency. Their public affairs office was overwhelmed, their defensive press release now looking like a pathetic lie. They had expected to control the story, to bury Frank in bureaucracy and legal maneuvers. They had not anticipated the power of a single, unblinking eye in the hands of a concerned neighbor. They had lost control of the narrative, and it was now being written by millions of furious Americans who had seen the truth with their own eyes. The wall of denial had been breached, not by a legal argument, but by a tidal wave of public fury. The viral video and the ensuing public pressure had a profound effect on the legal proceedings. The judge, a no-nonsense former prosecutor, swiftly denied the agency's motion to dismiss based on qualified immunity, ruling that any reasonable officer would know that violently removing a compliant disabled man from his wheelchair constitutes excessive force. The case would proceed to the discovery phase, and Elizabeth Reed was ready. Discovery is where legal battles are often won or lost, a methodical process of demanding documents, emails, and, most importantly, sworn testimony in the form of depositions. Elizabeth's first target was Agent Thorne. The deposition took place in a sterile conference room in a downtown law office. Thorne arrived flanked by two government lawyers, his face set in a stony, defiant mask. He still wore the air of a man convinced of his own righteousness, but there was a new tension around his eyes, the look of a man feeling the pressure. Elizabeth began calmly, asking basic questions about his training and the day of the raid. Thorne's answers were clipped and rehearsed. He stuck to the official story. The warrant was valid for the address. Miller was uncooperative. His actions were consistent with his training. He described Frank's refusal to move his wheelchair as passive resistance. Then, Elizabeth changed tactics. "Agent Thorne," she said, her voice still even, "are you familiar with a family by the name of Garcia?" The government lawyers immediately objected, calling the question irrelevant. "Your Honor, this goes to a pattern of conduct," Elizabeth countered to the court reporter. The objection was noted, and she was allowed to proceed. Thorne's composure cracked for the first time. A flicker of something, annoyance or perhaps recognition, crossed his face. "I don't recall specific names," he said evasively. "Let me refresh your memory," Elizabeth said, sliding a document across the table. "This is a civilian complaint filed against you 18 months ago by the Garcia family. It states that during a traffic stop, you held Mr. and Mrs. Garcia and their two young children at gunpoint for over an hour while you searched their vehicle without a warrant after they questioned your reason for stopping them. The complaint was ultimately dismissed. Do you recall that now?" Thorne's jaw tightened. The stop was justified. The complaint was baseless. "And what about the complaint from a Mr. David Chen?" Elizabeth continued, sliding another document across the table. "A software engineer who alleged you and your partner slammed him against his vehicle and illegally searched his backpack outside his own apartment building because he looked suspicious?" That one was also dismissed. One by one, Elizabeth produced a stack of files. They were all civilian complaints filed against Thorne over his 5-year career, 6 of them in total. All had been investigated internally, and all had been dismissed. But a clear pattern emerged. In each case, the complainant was a member of a minority group. In each case, the interaction began with a vague, subjective suspicion. And in each case, when Thorne's authority was questioned, even politely, he had escalated the situation dramatically, often with physical force or the threat of it. 6 complaints in 5 years, Agent Thorne, Elizabeth said, her voice now edged with steel. All alleging a similar pattern of behavior, profiling, escalation, and abuse of authority. And in every single case, the internal investigation cleared you of wrongdoing. Would you say you have a problem with people who question you? "I have a problem with criminals who obstruct my work," Thorne shot back, his voice rising. "This line of questioning is harassment. What you call harassment, Agent Thorne, I call establishing a pattern," Elizabeth said coolly. "A pattern that culminated in the assault of a disabled war hero in his own home. A pattern of a man who bullies anyone he perceives as a challenge to his authority." She then turned to the raid on Frank's house. "You said you perceived Sergeant Miller as a threat. What specifically did he do that was threatening?" "His demeanor was defiant," Thorne said. "He refused a lawful order to move." "He told you that you had the wrong house and that he was disabled, correct?" "Yes." "And instead of taking 30 seconds to verify the information in the wallet that was sitting in plain sight, you chose to use physical force. Why?" Thorne hesitated. "It was a dynamic situation. I had to maintain control." Elizabeth leaned forward. "Or is it that you simply don't like being told you're wrong, Agent Thorne? Is it that a man in a wheelchair, a man you saw as weak, had the audacity to stand up to you, and you felt the need to put him, quote, on the floor where you belong? She was using his own words against him. Thorne's face flushed a deep, angry red. He sputtered a denial, but the damage was done. The deposition, which would be transcribed and become part of the official record, painted a clear picture of Thorne not as a dedicated agent, but as a bully with a badge and a history of aggression. Elizabeth Reed had taken the first brick out of his wall of denial, and she was just getting started. While Elizabeth Reed was waging war in conference rooms and court filings, Frank Miller was fighting a quieter, more insidious battle within the confines of his own mind. The physical injuries were healing, albeit slowly. The cracked ribs made every breath a painful reminder, and the sprained shoulder sent shooting pains down his arm whenever he moved the wrong way. But it was the invisible wounds that festered, the psychological trauma of the assault that reopened scars he thought had long since faded. The assault had shattered more than just his door. It had shattered his sense of security. His home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a potential breach point. Every unexpected noise, a car backfiring down the street, a neighbor's dog barking too suddenly, sent a jolt of anxiety through him. He found himself checking the new deadbolt on his front door multiple times before bed, a ritual born of a newfound fear. The men who had attacked him wore the uniform of his own government, the very institution he had sworn to defend. This betrayal was a complex poison, twisting his patriotism into a confused knot of anger and disillusionment. His sleep was plagued by nightmares. Sometimes he was back in Fallujah, the air thick with sand and the smell of cordite, the screams of his men echoing in his ears. But more often now, the dreams were of his own living room. He would be trapped in his wheelchair, helpless, as Thorne's sneering face loomed over him, the room tilting and spinning before he was thrown into a black, endless void. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the phantom pain in his ribs and shoulder as real as any memory. The symptoms were all too familiar. He had fought a long, hard battle with post-traumatic stress disorder after returning from Iraq. Years of therapy, both at the VA and with a private counselor, had given him the tools to manage it, to pack the trauma away into carefully sealed boxes in his mind. But Thorne's assault had ripped those boxes open, scattering their contents, and the old demons came roaring back with a vengeance. He became withdrawn, even from the people trying to help. Carol would bring over food, but he would often just pick at it, his appetite gone. He stopped answering the emails for the Veterans Support Group, the task of offering guidance to others feeling hypocritical when he couldn't even manage his own emotional turmoil. The man who had been a rock for so many was now adrift himself. He felt a profound sense of shame. He was a Marine. Marines were supposed to be tough, unbreakable. But he felt broken, humiliated by the memory of lying helpless on his own floor. Thorne hadn't just assaulted his body, he had assaulted his identity, his deeply ingrained sense of self-reliance and strength. One afternoon, Maria, his late wife's sister, came to visit. She found him sitting in his living room, staring blankly at the spot on the floor where he had fallen. The television was on, but he wasn't watching it. "Frank," she said gently, sitting on the couch beside his chair, "you can't keep doing this to yourself. You need to talk to someone." "I'm fine," he mumbled, the automatic response of a man trained to hide his pain. "No, you're not," she said, her voice firm but kind. "You survived a war, Frank. You survived losing Sarah. You are one of the strongest people I know. But this is different. They didn't just hurt you, they betrayed you. And it's okay to not be okay about that. It's okay to need help." Her words pierced through the fog of his depression. He looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, his eyes were clear. He saw not pity, but understanding. He finally nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. The next day, he made a call to his old VA therapist. The sessions were difficult, forcing him to confront the raw emotions he had been suppressing, the rage, the fear, and the profound sense of helplessness. The legal case, with its constant need for him to recount the details of the assault for depositions and interviews, was a form of relentless re-traumatization. He had to relive his worst day over and over again. But with his therapist's help, he began to reframe the narrative. He was not just a victim, he was a survivor, fighting back. The lawsuit was not just about money, it was about reclaiming his agency, about ensuring that the invisible wounds he suffered would be made visible to the world. It was a new kind of battle, one fought not with a rifle but with resilience, and he was slowly, painfully, preparing himself for the fight ahead. Agent Patterson was not a bad man, but he was a weak one. The memory of Frank Miller on the floor, the sight of his overturned wheelchair, had haunted him since the day of the raid. He had followed Thorne's lead, had remained silent when he should have spoken up, and that complicity was eating him alive. He had a father who had served in Vietnam, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face superimposed on Frank's. The official report, which Thorne had written and he and Russo had been pressured to sign, was a work of fiction. It painted Frank as a belligerent obstacle and their own actions as a measured response. Every word of it felt like a betrayal of his oath. He watched with growing anxiety as the case exploded in the media. He saw the video, saw his own passive form standing in the background as Thorne committed the assault, and he felt a sickening wave of shame. He saw Thorne in his deposition, arrogantly lying under oath, and knew that he would be called to do the same. The pressure was immense. Thorne had made it clear that they were all in this together, and that any deviation from the official story would be seen as a betrayal, with severe professional consequences. But Patterson's conscience was a heavier burden than any career threat. His breaking point came during a conversation with his wife. She had seen the news reports and had recognized the back of his head in the video. She confronted him, her eyes full of a disappointment that was worse than any anger. "Is that what you do now, Mark?" she had asked, her voice quiet and full of pain. "Is that the man I married?" That night, he made a decision. He couldn't live with the lie anymore. He couldn't become a man his wife and his own father would be ashamed of. He knew he couldn't go through official channels. The internal investigation had already proven to be a whitewash designed to protect Thorne. He needed to go around the chain of command. He contacted a lawyer who in turn reached out to Elizabeth Reed with an offer. Agent Mark Patterson was willing to talk. The meeting was arranged in secret at a neutral location. Patterson was visibly nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder. He sat across from Elizabeth Reed, wringing his hands. "I just want to do the right thing," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "What I saw, what we did, it was wrong." Over the next 2 hours, Patterson laid it all out. He confirmed that Frank had been calm and cooperative from the start. He described Thorne's escalating anger, his refusal to listen to reason, and the brutal, unprovoked nature of the assault. Most damningly, he told Elizabeth about the aftermath, Thorne's explicit threat to Frank, and his direct order to him and Russo to falsify their reports. But he had brought more than just his testimony. He had brought proof. Before the raid, there had been an internal briefing. Thorne, Patterson explained, had been obsessed with making a high-profile arrest. The warrant for Marco Ramirez was based on a flimsy, uncorroborated tip from an unreliable informant. Thorne had pushed for the raid over the objections of his direct supervisor, who had urged caution. Patterson had copies of the internal emails. One from the supervisor read, "Thorne, I think you're moving too fast on this. The intel is thin. I recommend further surveillance before we execute." Thorne's reply was dismissive. "We need to be proactive. We can't let these guys get a foothold. I'm leading the entry team myself." These emails were a smoking gun. They proved that the agency's leadership knew the raid was based on questionable intelligence and that Thorne was a volatile element. Yet they had allowed it to happen. It demolished their claim that the agents were acting on credible intelligence and pointed to a culture of recklessness driven by Thorne's ambition. Patterson also provided a copy of Thorne's initial draft of the incident report, which he had accidentally saved to a shared drive before sanitizing it. The initial draft contained details he later removed, including a more accurate timeline that showed how little time they spent trying to verify Frank's identity before resorting to force. Elizabeth Reed listened, her expression calm, but her mind was racing, fitting these new pieces into her case. Patterson's testimony, backed by the internal documents, was a bombshell. It blew a hole clean through the agency's defense. It transformed the case from one man's word against another's into a documented conspiracy to commit and then cover up a civil rights violation. Agent Patterson was risking his career, his pension, everything he had worked for. But in that sterile lawyer's office, by choosing to speak the truth, the weak man finally found his strength. He had become the voice of conscience the case desperately needed. Elizabeth Reed did not sit on the whistleblower's evidence. She immediately filed a motion to amend their complaint, adding the explosive new allegations of a cover-up and supervisory negligence, and she attached the emails between Thorne and his supervisor as exhibits. The documents became part of the public record, and the effect was devastating for the agency. The credible intelligence narrative was officially dead. The media ran with the new story. Whistleblower, supervisor's new raid was risky. The agency's defense, already battered, was now crumbling. The pressure from Washington, which had been simmering, now boiled over. A congressional committee announced it would be holding hearings on the agency's training and oversight procedures, and they specifically requested the testimony of Agent Thorne's supervisor and the regional director. The government lawyers in charge of defending the agency could see the writing on the wall. A trial, which had once seemed like a winnable battle, now looked like a public execution. The combination of the viral video, Frank's unimpeachable status as a sympathetic victim, and now a whistleblower with internal documents was a prosecutor's dream and a defense attorney's nightmare. The potential for a massive headline-grabbing jury verdict was growing by the day. The order came down from the Department of Justice: settle this case and settle it now. The first call came to Elizabeth Reed's office a week after the whistleblower's evidence was filed. It was from the lead counsel for the government. After the usual legal pleasantries, he got to the point. "We are prepared to make an offer to resolve this matter," he said, his tone that of a man trying to sound reasonable while holding a losing hand. Elizabeth listened patiently. "In recognition of the, unfortunate circumstances," the lawyer continued, "and to spare Mr. Miller the further stress of litigation, the government is prepared to offer a settlement of $250,000. The silence on Elizabeth's end of the line was long and cold. The offer was an insult. It might cover Frank's immediate medical bills and the cost of his broken door, but it did nothing to address the pain, the trauma, the violation of his fundamental rights, or the agency's deliberate cover-up. It was a nuisance value offer, a lowball number thrown out in the hope that Frank was desperate enough to take it and go away. "Respectfully," Elizabeth finally said, her voice dripping with ice, "you can't be serious. We will see you in court." And she hung up. The call, however, was a sign of weakness. The agency was bleeding, and they knew it. 2 weeks later, another call came. This time, the offer was $750,000. They also offered to issue a formal apology to Sergeant Miller and to terminate Agent Thorne's employment. "This is a significant offer, Elizabeth," the lawyer argued. "It provides your client with security, and it ensures the agent responsible is held accountable." "Accountability is not just firing the man who threw the punch," Elizabeth shot back. "It's about the supervisors who led him. It's about the agency that covered for him. Your offer is still not in the same universe as what a jury will award. The answer is no." Frank was kept informed of the offers. The money, while substantial, was secondary to him. "It's not about the money, Liz," he told her, using the nickname she had insisted upon. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to another veteran. If we settle cheap, they'll just see it as the cost of doing business." His resolve strengthened hers. They were not just fighting for compensation, they were fighting for systemic change. The legal maneuvering continued, but the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. The agency was now on the defensive, desperate to avoid the public spectacle of a trial. They knew what Elizabeth knew. 12 ordinary citizens in a jury box, watching that video, hearing Frank's quiet testimony, and then learning about the deliberate cover-up, would be moved to deliver a verdict that would not just compensate, but punish. The lowball offers were the desperate flailing of a drowning institution. Elizabeth Reed ignored them and continued her methodical preparations for trial, sharpening her arguments, preparing her witnesses, and getting ready to deliver the final, decisive blow. 6 months later, the day Frank Miller had been both dreading and preparing for arrived. The federal courtroom was packed. The media filled several rows, and the public gallery was overflowing with supporters, many of them veterans wearing hats and jackets denoting their service. Agent Thorne sat at the defense table, looking pale and diminished, his arrogance replaced by a sullen fear. His co-defendants, Russo and Patterson, sat beside him, refusing to meet his gaze. Elizabeth Reed gave Frank's shoulder a reassuring squeeze before she approached the lectern. The plaintiff calls Sergeant Frank Miller to the stand. Frank navigated his wheelchair through the courtroom, the quiet whir of its motor the only sound in the cavernous, silent room. He positioned himself beside the witness stand, and the bailiff administered the oath. He looked out at the jury, 12 ordinary men and women who held his fate and the fate of his case in their hands. Elizabeth began her questioning gently, establishing his background. She had him describe his 20 years in the Marine Corps, his tours of duty, the circumstances of the injury that had cost him his legs. He spoke in a clear, steady voice, without embellishment or self-pity. He wasn't asking for sympathy, he was just stating the facts of his life. "Sergeant Miller," Elizabeth said, her voice soft, "could you please tell the jury what happened on the morning of October 12th? Frank took a breath and began. He recounted the story with the same dispassionate precision he had used in Elizabeth's office months ago. He described his peaceful morning routine, the sudden violent banging on his door, and his attempts to explain to the agents that they had made a mistake. He didn't raise his voice or display anger. He simply walked the jury through the events, step by step. Agent Thorne seemed angry, Frank said, choosing his words carefully. He didn't seem to want to listen. He just kept saying I was uncooperative. "And were you uncooperative, Sergeant?" Elizabeth asked. "No, ma'am," Frank replied. "I was sitting in my wheelchair in my own living room. I told him my name and offered to show him my identification. I was trying to de-escalate the situation." He then described the assault itself. His voice, for the first time, held a slight tremor, not of fear, but of the memory of the pain and humiliation. "He grabbed my shoulder, and he pulled me out of my chair. I hit the floor. The impact knocked the wind out of me. My head hit the wood." He paused, taking a moment to compose himself. The courtroom was utterly still. Several jurors leaned forward, their faces etched with concentration and empathy. "I remember lying on the floor and he was standing over me, telling me he was arresting me for assaulting him." A quiet gasp went through the courtroom. "Did you at any point assault Agent Thorne or any of the other agents?" Elizabeth asked. "No, ma'am. I never touched them." Finally, Elizabeth addressed the threat. "Sergeant, after the agents realized they had the wrong man, what did Agent Thorne say to you?" Frank looked directly at Agent Thorne at the defense table. Thorne quickly looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "He squatted down next to me on the floor," Frank said, his voice dropping but clear in the silent room. "He told me to forget they were ever there. He said that if I told anyone what happened, he would ruin me." The testimony was devastating in its simplicity and sincerity. Frank Miller was not a slick or polished witness. He was just a man telling the unvarnished truth. He came across exactly as he was, a quiet, dignified man who had been brutally wronged. His power was in his credibility. Nothing about him felt false or exaggerated. He was a hero, not because of what he said on the stand, but because of who he was. When the government's lawyer rose to cross-examine him, he faced an impossible task. He tried to poke holes in Frank's story, to paint him as confused or uncooperative. Isn't it true, Sergeant, that you refused a direct order from a federal agent? I refused to let them search my home without a valid reason, yes, Frank answered calmly. That is my right as a citizen. And in a tense, dynamic situation, couldn't your refusal be interpreted as resistance? The lawyer pressed. Frank paused for a long moment before answering, his gaze sweeping over the jury. Sir, he said, his voice resonating with the quiet authority of a man who had led others in battle. I know what resistance looks like, and I know what a scared man lying on his own floor looks like. On that day, I was the latter. The cross-examination fell apart after that. The lawyer had no more questions. As Frank wheeled himself away from the stand, a quiet ripple of applause started in the back of the courtroom from the assembled veterans, a spontaneous breach of decorum that the judge, for a moment, allowed to continue before gently gaveling for order. Frank had done his part. He had told his truth. Now it was up to the jury to recognize it. The day after Frank's testimony, Elizabeth Reed called her final key witness, Agent Mark Patterson. But first, she had a piece of evidence to introduce. Your Honor, she announced, the plaintiff would like to play for the jury the video recording of the incident. The courtroom lights dimmed, and a large screen descended from the ceiling. For the next 15 minutes, the jury was transported to the quiet suburban street, watching through Carol Peterson's window. They saw the violent breach of the door. They heard the muffled shouting. And then, they saw the moment that had shocked a nation. The image of Agent Thorne violently pulling a disabled man from his wheelchair and casting him to the floor was even more horrific on the large screen. Audible gasps filled the courtroom. Several jurors physically recoiled, one woman bringing a hand to her mouth in shock. The raw brutality of the act, captured so clearly, needed no explanation. The video ended, and the lights came back up, revealing the stunned and horrified faces of the jury. They glanced from the now blank screen to Agent Thorne, their expressions a mixture of disgust and contempt. It was into this charged atmosphere that Agent Mark Patterson was called to the stand. Dressed in a somber gray suit, he looked like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He calmly and methodically corroborated every detail of Frank's testimony. He described Thorne's agitation, his refusal to listen, and the unprovoked nature of the assault. Did Sergeant Miller ever resist, physically or otherwise? Elizabeth asked. No, ma'am, Patterson said firmly. He was calm. He was cooperative. Then Elizabeth led him to the cover-up. Agent Patterson, after the assault, what did Agent Thorne instruct you to do? Patterson took a deep breath. He told us to say that Sergeant Miller had been non-compliant and had been injured while resisting. He ordered us to falsify our reports. This was the final nail in the coffin. A federal agent, under oath, admitting to a conspiracy to cover up the crime. The climax of the trial came during Elizabeth Reed's cross-examination of Agent Thorne. He took the stand, still clinging to his fabricated story, but his bravado was gone, replaced by a desperate defensive energy. He tried to claim the video was misleading, that it didn't capture Frank's aggressive posture. Aggressive posture? Elizabeth repeated with incredulity. Agent Thorne, are you asking this jury to believe that you felt threatened by a disabled man sitting in a wheelchair? Thorne stammered, claiming his training taught him to see threats everywhere. Elizabeth then projected the email from his supervisor onto the large screen, the one advising caution before the raid. Your supervisor urged caution, didn't he, Agent Thorne? He told you the intel was thin. Thorne claimed it was a professional disagreement. Then Elizabeth moved in for the kill. She looked him directly in the eye, her voice low and sharp. Agent Patterson, your partner has testified under oath that you ordered him to lie on his official report. Are you calling your fellow agent a liar? Thorne's face went white. He was trapped. To deny it would be to commit perjury in front of a jury that had already heard Patterson's credible testimony. To admit it would be to confess to a felony. He looked at his lawyers, who could offer him no help. He looked at the jury, who stared back at him with cold, unforgiving eyes. I may have suggested a way to phrase the report to reflect the dynamic nature of the encounter, he mumbled, the words weak and evasive. Is that what you call it? Elizabeth thundered, her voice filling the courtroom. Suggesting a phrasing? Or was it a direct order to conceal a crime? The crime you committed when you assaulted a man, a decorated Marine, a war hero, in his own home. She let the accusation hang in the air. You weren't upholding the law that day, were you, Agent Thorne? You were breaking it. You weren't a hero, you were a bully. And when you realized the magnitude of your mistake, you didn't try to fix it. You tried to bury it by threatening a helpless man and ordering your own partners to lie for you. Isn't that the truth, Agent Thorne? Thorne stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. He was a liar who had run out of lies, a bully who had finally been confronted by a force he couldn't intimidate. In the face of the undeniable truth of the video and the damning testimony of his former partner, his entire defense had unraveled. He sat there, exposed and defeated, a man utterly destroyed by his own arrogance and cruelty. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. When they filed back into the jury box, their faces were solemn and determined. Frank Miller sat in his wheelchair at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Elizabeth Reed placed a calming hand on his arm. The court clerk took the verdict form from the foreperson, a middle-aged woman who refused to look at the defense table. The clerk's voice was steady as he read the verdict. On the charge of excessive force against Agent Thorne, we, the jury, find for the plaintiff. On the charge of unlawful entry against all defendants, we find for the plaintiff. On the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice, we find for the plaintiff. He continued down the list of charges, and with each one, the outcome was the same. It was a complete and total victory. Then came the damages. For compensatory damages, including medical expenses, pain, and suffering, we award the plaintiff, Mr. Franklin Miller, the sum of $7 million. A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Frank's eyes widened in disbelief. But the foreperson wasn't finished. Furthermore, the clerk read, his voice rising slightly, for punitive damages, intended to punish the defendants and deter future misconduct, we award the plaintiff the sum of $20 million. The courtroom erupted. The total award was $27 million. It was a landmark verdict, a number so significant it was a clear and unambiguous condemnation of the agents and the agency's actions. Frank stared straight ahead, tears welling in his eyes for the first time. They were not tears of sadness, but of profound, overwhelming relief. It wasn't about the money, it was about the number. It was a number that screamed, "We believe you, we see what they did, and it was not okay." Elizabeth Reed hugged him, her professional composure finally breaking into a wide, triumphant smile. Across the courtroom, Agent Thorne slumped in his chair, a broken man, his face ashen. Justice had been served. The verdict sent shockwaves through the federal government. Agent Thorne was not only fired, but was also indicted on federal criminal charges of perjury and deprivation of rights under color of law. The congressional hearings intensified, leading to the resignation of the agency's regional director and the implementation of sweeping mandatory reforms in training, supervision, and the handling of civilian complaints. Frank Miller's case became a catalyst for change, a textbook example of how one man's refusal to be silenced could force a powerful institution to confront its own corruption. In the quiet aftermath, as the media storm subsided and the lawyers packed their briefcases, Frank Miller returned to his small bungalow. The check, when it arrived, was an almost absurdly large number on a piece of paper. He used it to set up a foundation to provide legal and financial support for disabled veterans who had been mistreated by the very system meant to serve them. His life returned to its quiet routines, but something fundamental had changed. The ghosts of helplessness had been banished, replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down a new kind of enemy and won. The question of why Agent Thorne acted as he did is a complex one. His actions were not born from a single simple motive, but from a toxic brew of personal insecurity, unchecked power, and a system that rewarded aggression over discernment. Thorne, a young man in a position of immense authority, likely saw the world through a lens of perpetual threat. To him, compliance was the only acceptable response, and any questioning of his authority was not a citizen exercising their rights, but an enemy revealing their defiance. Frank's quiet dignity, his status as a veteran, and his physical disability might have subconsciously registered to Thorne as a challenge. How dare this man, this cripple, question him? The violence wasn't just a mistake in procedure. It was a desperate, ugly assertion of dominance from a man whose own sense of power was fragile. Had Thorne been properly supervised, had his previous complaints been taken seriously instead of being swept under the rug, he might never have been in a position to shatter Frank's life. The system that was supposed to provide guardrails had instead given him a license to bully. If Frank had possessed a security camera inside his home, would the agents have acted differently? Perhaps. The knowledge of being recorded can be a powerful deterrent to misconduct. If he had immediately stated, "My neighbor is a police officer and is watching," would it have given Thorne pause? It's impossible to know. But these hypotheticals highlight a crucial truth. In a confrontation with authority, creating witnesses, whether electronic or human, can fundamentally shift the balance of power. Frank's greatest weapon in the end was not his own strength, but the truth recorded by a neighbor's steady hand. The core lesson of Frank Miller's ordeal is one of profound and enduring value. Dignity is not something that can be given or taken away by force. It is an internal fortress. They threw his body to the floor, but they could not touch his spirit. They tried to bury him in lies, but the truth, nourished by courage and community, found its way to the light. His fight reminds us that true strength is not the ability to break down a door, but the resilience to stand up, even when you can no longer stand, and quietly speak the truth to power. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power and felt helpless to do anything? What do you think is the most effective way for ordinary citizens to hold authority accountable? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And please share this story to honor all the quiet heroes like Sergeant Miller.